Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise and get straight to the core of complex topics using the source material you provide.
Oh,
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a fascinating document. It explores the evolution and the driving forces behind India's policy toward its immediate neighbors.
right, with a particular focus on its recent neighborhood-first approach.
Exactly. And this isn't just a dry look at diplomacy, it's a story deeply intertwined with history, geography, economics.
And the dynamic shifts in global power playing out right on India's borders. It's a really complex mix.
There really is.
And we have a really insightful piece of analysis here. It doesn't just describe India's neighborhood policy.
Yeah.
It actually traces its origins, how it's adapted over time, and the underlying logic, or sometimes maybe the lack thereof, that has guided it.
That's a good point.
It helps us understand the current approach, really, by looking back at the legacy India inherited and, well, the challenges it's faced.
And our mission today is to unpack the most important nuggets from this source material for you. We want to understand that crucial historical context, identify the consistent challenges India has grappled with, clarify the stated goals of the current policy, and look closely at some of the specific initiatives.
But also the controversies, right? The source highlights those too.
Oh, absolutely. Importantly, the controversies mentioned in the text.
Yeah, and this topic is incredibly relevant, I think. Understanding how a major regional power like India interacts with its immediate surroundings gives you a vital lens on broader international relations.
Yeah.
The complexities of economic connectivity in, diverse regions, and the enduring impact of historical forces on present-day foreign policy decisions. It's really about seeing the ripple effects of history and geography.
Absolutely. So get ready for some really surprising facts, some sharp insights, and hopefully some key takeaways that will stick with you. Let's unpack this.
Okay.
Starting right at the beginning with the historical analysis of India's engagement with its neighborhood.
Right. To really understand India's current policy, the source insists we need to start with the British legacy.
Okay.
After the decline of the Mughal Empire, the entire South Asian subcontinent for a period was brought under a single administrative and strategic umbrella by the British.
Right. And the British had a very distinct strategic concern, didn't they? And a specific approach to deal with it, which the source calls the double line of defense. Can you explain what that entailed?
Essentially, the British Raj was deeply concerned about the great powers to the north, particularly Russia and China,
Right.
expanding their influence southwards towards their Indian empire. So to counter this, they didn't rely on defending the immediate border of British India.
Okay, so not the border itself.
No. Instead, they pursued a policy based on controlling the reverse slopes of the Himalayas.
The reverse slopes.
Yeah, think of the Himalayas as this massive wall. The British aimed to control the smaller states situated on the southern or reverse side of that wall, countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, parts of modern-day Pakistan, and Afghanistan.
So they weren't just defending the top of the wall, but consolidating control over the slopes below the top edge
Yeah.
to prevent anyone from climbing over unnoticed.
Precisely. The policy was one of strategic subordination. They ensured these states were either directly controlled, like Sikkim was, or heavily influenced and bound by treaties, like Nepal and Bhutan, so they functioned as buffer zones. The goal was to create a strategic fence, a double line, keeping those northern powers at a distance.
Keeping them out.
Yeah, preventing them from gaining a foothold close to British India itself.
That makes a lot of sense as a defensive strategy using the geography. But then came partition in 1947. How did that event change this long-standing strategic calculus?
Well, the source highlights that partition fundamentally reversed the reverse slope policy.
Completely reversed it.
Pretty much. When British India was divided into independent India and Pakistan, it created new borders, new states, and critically, it broke the unified strategic space the British had controlled. This act essentially opened the door for foreign intervention and influence within the subcontinent in a way that, well, hadn't really been possible under unified British rule.
Even though India lost territory on its western and eastern flanks during partition, it still emerged as the preeminent regional power. Is that right?
Absolutely. Despite the territorial division, India retained the vast majority of the landmass and occupied the central, geographically dominant position within the newly formed South Asian region.
So size and location.
Yeah, this sheer size and location automatically positioned it as the major power.
And this geographical reality shaped India's security thinking going forward.
Fundamentally. India's security conception immediately became broader than just national borders. It became deeply geopolitical and regional.
Okay.
The Indian leadership understood that its security wasn't just threatened by direct aggression, but perhaps even more so by instability or weakness in its immediate neighbors.
Why was that?
Because a weak or unstable neighbor could potentially invite external powers, the very powers the British had sought to keep out right into the region.
Ah, okay. So the fear was that if a neighbor couldn't stand on its own, it might lean on or be exploited by a powerful external state.
Exactly.
Bringing that external power right into India's backyard.
That's the central anxiety. India perceives that any external power gaining significant influence over a South Asian neighbor poses a direct challenge to India's own security and regional standing.
And the source uses Pakistan as an example here.
It does. It uses Pakistan as a prime example. While India has always desired a stable Pakistan because instability increases the risk of external interference, it simultaneously didn't want a Pakistan so strong economically or militarily that it could directly threaten India. It's a delicate balance.
A tricky line to walk, and the source points to China's role in this dynamic.
It does, specifically. The source mentions China's significant investments in Pakistan, such as the development of the Gwadar port and the massive China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC.
Right,
From India's perspective, these aren't purely economic projects. They're seen as China's deliberate strategy to strengthen Pakistan's economy and infrastructure,
which in turn
serves to check India's influence and strategic options in the region. That's how it's perceived.
So historical geography, partition, the fear of external powers leveraging weak neighbors, this all sets the stage for India's view of its sphere of influence.
It does. And this leads to a concept that scholars have termed the Indian Monroe Doctrine.
The Indian Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah. The source explains that India's regional security policy from the very beginning has been rooted in the deep-seated belief that the South Asian subcontinent constitutes its exclusive sphere of influence.
Okay.
The idea is that India should be the primary, if not the only, power intervening or shaping events within this region.
Like the United States and the Western Hemisphere back in the 19th century telling European powers to stay out.
Precisely the analogy used by the source. India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, articulated this view early on.
Nehru did.
Yes. He strongly advocated for foreign colonial powers to completely withdraw from South Asia and saw the region as distinct from the global power blocs emerging elsewhere. He resonated strongly with that anti-colonial sentiment, the same sentiment that underpinned the original Monroe Doctrine, but applied it to post-colonial South Asia.
But was independent India capable of providing the same kind of security umbrella the British Empire had?
Well, the source is quite direct in saying no. No. While the British had the resources and established administrative and military structures to extend a degree of security and governance, post-independence India lacked that capacity.
Right.
It was a new state, still grappling with its own development challenges. It didn't have the resources, the military might, or the governance experience to genuinely act as a full-fledged security provider and benefactor to its neighbors in the way a classical hegemon might.
And during Nehru's time, India's primary foreign policy focus was elsewhere, wasn't it? More on the global stage.
Yes, that's right. Nehru was deeply committed to his global strategy of non-alignment. The goal was to position India as an independent force, not tied to either the U.S. or Soviet blocs during the bipolar Cold War, because so much energy and attention were directed towards this global positioning.
Understandable.
The neighborhood policy, while important, didn't always receive the sustained, dedicated focus it perhaps needed.
So we have this background of inherited geography, the shock of partition, the fear of external intervention, the idea of an Indian Monroe Doctrine without the full capacity to back it up, and a global policy that sometimes overshadowed regional needs. How did things change under Indira Gandhi?
Indira Gandhi marked a significant turning point. She explicitly introduced the concept of bilateralism as a core tenet of India's neighborhood policy.
Bilateralism?
Yes. Her firm insistence was that any issues or disputes between India and a neighboring state should be resolved purely bilaterally.
Meaning just between the two countries.
Exactly. Directly between the two countries involved, without the involvement or mediation of any external power.
So, firmly rejecting third-party intervention in regional affairs.
Absolutely. She wanted to draw a clear boundary, ensuring that external global powers, who were very much present during the Cold War, wouldn't get involved in India's regional dynamics. However, The source points out a really fascinating set of contradictions in India's policy during this era.
Contradictions, what were they?
Well, regionally, within South Asia, India's policy under Indira Gandhi implicitly operated on the principles of balance of power and sphere of influence, the very ideas behind the Indian Monroe Doctrine.
Right?
Yet globally, India was a vocal advocate against these concepts, promoting non-alignment and self-determination.
Hmm.
Regionally, India was willing to provide security, sometimes through military intervention, to small nations, while globally opposing the intervention of great powers in weaker states' affairs. And perhaps most starkly, while she preached bilateralism for regional issues, India was a strong proponent of multilateralism on the global stage, engaging actively in international forums like the United Nations and the Non-Aligned Movement.
That is a striking inconsistency. It seems like different rules applied regionally versus globally.
It highlights the tension, doesn't it, between India's aspirations to be a global moral leader and its pragmatic security concerns and power dynamics in its immediate neighborhood.
Definitely.
Another defining characteristic of Indira's policy was the willingness to use military intervention if she felt a neighbor's actions or instability directly threatened India's security.
And the source points to a major event as an example of this, right?
Yes, the 1971 intervention in what was then East Pakistan, leading to the creation of Bangladesh, is presented as a clear manifestation of this policy.
Intervention when perceived security interests were at stake.
Exactly. And these actions were seen by many neighbors as India adopting an overtly interventionist posture in regional affairs.
And this tendency continued under Rajiv Gandhi.
It did. The source mentions India's interventions in the Maldives and Sri Lanka in the 1980s during Rajiv Gandhi's premiership.
Okay.
Following on from the Indira Doctrine, these actions solidified the perception among neighbors that India was willing to interfere in their internal affairs. This pattern transformed India into what the source terms a perceptual regional hegemon.
Perceptual regional hegemon. So it was the perception of India acting like a dominant power, not necessarily the reality.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that this was often a perception rather than a reality of India consistently providing the benefits expected of a true hegemon. Scholars, according to the source, questioned whether India was genuinely acting as a regional provider of economic and security benefits.
The role a stabilizing hegemon ideally plays.
Right. Or if it was merely acting in a self-interested interventionist manner that generated fear and resentment rather than cooperation and stability.
So short-term power projection, but maybe not long-term trust.
That seems to be the argument. The interventions might have projected power in the short term, but didn't necessarily build long-term trust or shared benefit.
So by the end of the Cold War, this interventionist phase had created a lot of friction and anti-Indian sentiment.
It had. And India began to realize that this approach was becoming unsustainable, both politically and economically. Indian policymakers were visibly concerned by the rising tide of anti-Indian sentiment throughout the neighborhood.
Understandably.
The source provides a specific example from the mid-1990s during water-sharing treaty negotiations with Nepal.
What was the issue there?
During the Mahakali Treaty negotiations in 1996, despite India's intentions, a narrative gained traction in Nepal that India was trying to grab Nepal's most vital national resource, its water.
Oh, wow.
This kind of perception, which deepened existing crises in the 1990s, starkly illustrated that India's historical approaches were not building goodwill, and that a fundamental shift in strategy was desperately needed.
Okay, so the need for a new approach was clear. What direction did P.V. Narasimha Rao take?
When P.V. Narasimha Rao took office, his approach marked a retreat from those interventionist policies. He introduced what was essentially a hands-off policy.
Hands off.
Yeah. The idea was to consciously avoid interfering in the internal political or economic functioning of the neighboring states.
A direct reaction to the perceived overreach of the previous decades.
Likely. The aim was to stop generating new tensions by simply backing away from active involvement.
Did it work?
Well, the source note that while this approach successfully avoided creating new problems or antagonizing neighbors further, it equally failed to actively contribute to solving the old, long-standing issues that continued to fester in bilateral relationships.
Ah, so less friction, but also stagnation.
Exactly. It was a period of reduced friction, but also stagnation.
And this period paved the way for the first formally articulated doctrine, specifically for the neighborhood, the Gujral Doctrine.
Exactly. I.K. Gujral, during his brief tenure as prime minister in the late 1990s, introduced what is widely recognized as India's first proper doctrine, focused specifically on its neighbors.
What were the core principles of the Gujral Doctrine? It sounds important.
It was. The doctrine was famously based on the principles of non-reciprocity and generosity.
Non-reciprocity and generosity.
Yes, Gujral's core idea was that India, being the much larger country, should be willing to make unilateral concessions and be generous towards its smaller neighbors without necessarily demanding immediate reciprocal benefits.
That sounds like a radical departure from previous approaches, which often felt, well, transactional or palin-driven.
It truly was. The aim was ambitious: to build an immense reservoir of goodwill in the neighborhood, dismantle anti-India sentiment, and demonstrate clearly to neighboring states that close cooperation with India offered tangible economic and political benefits.
Trying to reset the relationship.
Very much so. An attempt to reset the relationship based on trust and India's benevolent intentions.
How was it received, and what were its limitations? Did it stick?
Well, the source notes that the principles of non-reciprocity and generosity were broadly appreciated by India's neighbors. That part was positive. However, internally, some in the Indian foreign policy establishment found the doctrine too idealistic, perhaps naive about the realpolitik of the region.
Idealism versus realism.
Right. And crucially, the source identifies two main missing links or shortcomings. Firstly, Gujral's time as prime minister was short.
Not enough time.
Exactly, which meant he lacked the political longevity and capital to fully embed this philosophy within the Indian bureaucracy and convince them of the long-term value of this kind of cooperation.
Right. Bureaucratic inertia can be powerful.
Definitely. And secondly, despite advocating for generosity and open ties, the doctrine was surprisingly hesitant or reluctant when it came to genuinely opening up foreign trade with neighbors.
Really? That seems like a contradiction.
It does. So good principles, but implementation challenges in some key areas like trade weren't fully integrated.
Okay. So what happened when the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, came to power in 1998? How did things shift then?
The source points out that the initial period for the BJP government was dominated by immediate security concerns. They had to manage the international fallout from India's nuclear tests, Pokhran-2.
Right, the nuclear tests.
And a significant amount of their energy was also focused on dealing with the perceived rise in state-sponsored terrorism emanating from Pakistan. There was a strong belief that Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, had deepened its presence and influence in countries like Nepal and Bangladesh.
So, concerns about ISI activities.
Yes, the hijacking of Indian Airlines flight IC-814 in 1999 is mentioned as a specific, dramatic event that policymakers saw as stark evidence of this increased ISI influence in the neighborhood.
So immediate security threats really colored their initial view.
Right. As they began to engage with the neighborhood more broadly, the BJP government, particularly under Prime Minister Atal Vajpayee, attempted to use the platform of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SAARC, for regional cooperation.
Using SAARC again.
Yes. However, the source states that they ultimately weren't able to achieve significant breakthroughs with SAARC, attributing this lack of success largely to persistent problems and resistance from Pakistan.
Pakistan remained an obstacle.
According to the source, yes.
And what was Vajpayee's larger vision for SAARC? Did he have one?
Oh, he articulated a truly grand vision for the region. He envisioned upgrading SAARC into something akin to a South Asian Union.
Like the EU.
Exactly, drawing inspiration from the European Union's model. The idea was to move towards a free trade area among member states with only a very small negative list of excluded items.
Ambitious.
Very. The ambition was not just economic integration, but potentially moving towards a political union over time, fostering deep interconnectedness across South Asia.
That's a bold vision. Why did it ultimately fall short? What happened?
The source suggests a key reason was India's continued insistence, under the BJP, on linking economic cooperation to the resolution of political disputes, and demanding a kind of security guarantee from neighbors as a prerequisite for deeper economic ties. This approach likely alienated some neighbors and contrasted sharply with the Gujral Doctrine's non-reciprocity.
Okay.
Furthermore, historically, trade within South Asia had plummeted after the 1947 partition borders were drawn. Pakistan, citing political disputes, never genuinely opened up trade with India. Bangladesh, after some initial enthusiasm post-independence, also pulled back. Border trade was minimal.
So history weighed heavily.
It did. While globalization did push some states towards cautious opening, The consistent trade surplus India held made neighbors wary of further liberalization anyway.
So, historical mistrust, unresolved political issues, and uneven economic benefits continue to hinder integration efforts. And under the next government, Manmohan Singh's UPA, what was their approach?
The United Progressive Alliance government under Manmohan Singh continued to use SAARC as a primary vehicle for regional engagement and generally favored a policy of political dialogue to address issues.
Dialogue focused.
Yes. And the source makes an interesting observation here, that while they didn't publicly brand it as such, the UPA government almost followed all dimensions of the Gujral Doctrine.
Really? So the principles of generosity and non-reciprocity were still quietly influencing policy, even if not explicitly stated?
It appears so, according to the source. It suggests that some of the core ideas from the Gujral era had subtly been absorbed into the policy approach, even without the explicit public acknowledgement. Interesting, isn't it?
It is. This brings us to the more recent past and the formal announcement of the Neighborhood First policy, which gained prominence around 2014. What was the broader context that made this specific policy approach necessary at that time? What had changed?
Well, the source identifies several crucial shifts in the post-Cold War landscape that shaped the environment for Neighborhood First. Firstly, there was significantly increased international involvement in regional affairs.
How so?
For instance, the U.S. presence in Afghanistan solidified its strategic partnership with Pakistan, which remains central to the Afghan conflict and, reliant on Pakistan's cooperation.
So external powers weren't just theoretical threats anymore. They were actively engaged on the ground in the region.
Exactly. The source also points to other examples, like Norway's mediation attempts in the Sri Lankan Civil War involving the LTTE.
Right, the Tamil Tigers.
And countries like Nepal continuing their reliance on external powers for substantial economic aid. But perhaps the most significant change causing notable jitters in India was the accelerating rise of China and its increasing presence in the region.
Ah, the China factor, especially their infrastructure and connectivity projects.
Precisely. China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, began making significant inroads across South Asia. We're talking massive investments in infrastructure like ports, roads, power plants.
All over the region.
Yes. And coupled with China's growing naval presence in the Indian Ocean, this was perceived in India as a direct strategic challenge within its traditional sphere of influence.
A direct competitor for influence emerging forcefully in India's backyard.
Absolutely. The source also brings in scholarly perspectives from this period, noting that India's own growing global ambitions and its efforts to project itself as a rising power were sometimes viewed by international scholars through a regional lens.
How are they viewed?
Some read India's actions as tending towards proto-imperialism in South Asia. Others even went so far as to perceive India as a second-tier imperialist power in the region.
Wow, strong words.
Yes, arguing that while it aspired to dominance, it lacked the genuine capacity to enhance its influence effectively or provide the expected benefits of a benevolent power.
Those are sharp criticisms.
They are. But the source then contrasts these scholarly views with what it describes as the ground reality.
Okay, what's the ground reality according to the source?
According to the source, despite India's stated aspirations, its actual ability to consistently push a strong, cohesive regional agenda has remained relatively weak.
Weak? What?
This weakness, the source argues, is partly due to a deep-seated societal trend evident across South Asia since the Cold War.
And what is that trend?
The source suggests that rather than fostering close cooperation with each other, states and societies across South Asia have tended to consistently look towards the north.
Towards the north, meaning?
Meaning towards external powers for economic resources, technology, and political support. This historical orientation towards powers outside the region has meant that intra-regional economic interaction and integration have been persistently neglected.
So neighbors have historically preferred engaging with global powers rather than building strong ties within South Asia, including with India. Is that it?
That's the dynamic described by the source, and it presents a fundamental challenge to India's regional aspirations. The source revisits the hegemon critique here.
Right.
Arguing that the scholarly view of India as a hegemon might not be genuine because, as we discussed, a true hegemon is supposed to provide economic and security benefits to the region.
Which India hasn't consistently done.
Something the source contends India hasn't consistently or effectively done in South Asia.
So this complex backdrop of increased external presence, particularly China, past policy failures leading to mistrust, scholarly critiques questioning India's effectiveness, And a regional trend of looking outwards, this is the environment that compelled India to formalize a new strategy.
Exactly. It's against this complex canvas, and with the explicit aim of addressing the shortcomings and challenges of previous approaches, that the Neighborhood First policy was formally announced by the Modi government in 2014.
And the policy certainly started with a very visible political statement, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The launch was marked by a significant gesture when Prime Minister Modi invited the heads of state of all SAARC nations to his swearing-in ceremony in May 2014.
A big signal.
Yes, intended as a strong symbolic signal that the neighborhood would be a top priority for his government.
What is the core idea, the central vision behind Neighborhood First?
The fundamental concept is to inextricably link India's own domestic economic development and prosperity with the development and prosperity of the entire South Asian region.
Linking fates, essentially.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
The policy places a special emphasis on revitalizing SAARC and leveraging regional cooperation mechanisms to transform South Asia into a genuinely integrated economic union built on vastly enhanced connectivity, physical, digital, and cultural.
And the source noted it borrows from Gujral.
Yes, it notes that, much like the UPA government perhaps did quietly, this policy has picked up grains from the Gujral doctrine. Those ideas of generosity and non-reciprocity, even if that heritage isn't always explicitly acknowledged.
So borrowing from past attempts at building goodwill, but adding a stronger focus on integration and connectivity.
Yes, India has publicly committed to dedicating substantial political and diplomatic capital to fostering this cooperation. The special thrust is clearly on improving connectivity.
Infrastructure.
Yes, infrastructure like roads, rail, ports, inland waterways, digital links, seeing this as the vital engine for facilitating mutual cooperation and driving shared prosperity across the region.
And the policy has a specific slogan or mantra that encapsulates this vision, doesn't it?
It does. The core philosophy is captured in the phrase Vistarvad Nahi Vikasvad.
Which means?
It translates from Hindi as, the focus is not expansionism, but development for all. It's a deliberate framing intended to counter historical perceptions of India as seeking dominance or expansion.
Right, those hegemon perceptions.
Exactly, and instead emphasize a shared future based on collective growth.
That mantra directly addresses the past critiques of interventionism and hegemony.
It does. And to operationalize this, India aims to establish what the source calls a developmental compact with South Asia.
A developmental compact.
Yeah. This involves providing neighbors with various forms of assistance. Lines of credit for infrastructure projects, outright grants, initiatives focused on skill development, and technology transfers. These are intended to act as catalysts, empowering growth and fostering interdependence across the region.
So shifting the focus from military intervention or political dominance to economic partnership and development, how has this policy been implemented on the ground, and what are some specific initiatives we've seen?
Well, the source notes the Neighborhood First has definitely injected a new level of energy into India's engagements at two key levels. First is strengthening and building defense relationships.
This seems linked to the strategic competition you mentioned earlier, especially with China.
Absolutely. The post-Cold War environment, particularly the growing Chinese economic influence in the neighborhood, has significant strategic consequences that India had to address. Scholars, according to the source, feel that India was perhaps late in fully grasping this strategic dynamic, but is now actively seeking to expand its defense and strategic influence under the Neighborhood First umbrella as a way to catch up and balance China's presence.
Is there an example?
Yes. A concrete example provided is the Defense Cooperation Framework Pact, concluded during Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's state visit to India in 2017.
Okay, so defense diplomacy is definitely a tool within the Neighborhood First policy.
Precisely. The second level where energy has been infused is in committing to various development projects in neighboring states.
The development compact idea.
Exactly. India has announced and committed funds to numerous infrastructure and development projects across the region. However,
What's the however?
Yes. The source immediately points out several significant constraints and challenges that have hampered India's ability to effectively implement these commitments.
What are these constraints in practice? What's holding things back?
Firstly, the source mentions inadequate resources. India, despite its size, still faces resource constraints relative to the scale of the needs in the neighborhood and, frankly, the ambitions of the projects being discussed.
Okay, limited resources. What else?
Secondly, and diplomatic observers have highlighted this repeatedly, even when funds are committed, India often fails to invest sufficient diplomatic capital and bureaucratic energy to actively follow up, monitor, and push these projects through to completion.
Ah, the follow-through problem.
Exactly. This leads to significant delays and lags in project delivery on the ground, which can frustrate the neighbors, understandably.
So the intentions are there, the funds might be committed, but the execution is often slow or gets bogged down.
That's a key critique in the source. And thirdly, the source identifies a certain strategic diffidence within India's strategic culture.
Strategic diffidence.
Yeah, which is aggravated by a tendency towards going solo.
What does strategic diffidence mean here, and going solo?
Strategic diffidence suggests a certain hesitation or lack of boldness in India's strategic planning or execution, perhaps an unwillingness to think or act truly big or long-term in a coordinated way.
Okay.
This, the source argues, is made worse by India's habit of trying to undertow complex, large-scale strategic engagements, like developing ports or major connectivity corridors entirely by itself, without seeking collaboration or partnership with other like-minded international players.
So India tries to do everything itself, maybe gets bogged down due to capacity issues, and this is linked to a cautious strategic mindset.
That seems to be the critique laid out in the source. And to address these constraints, inadequate resources, lack of follow-through, strategic dividends, and the going solo problem, the source suggests that India desperately needs to evolve a genuine grand strategy for its neighborhood.
A grand strategy.
Yes. And crucially, it must adopt a multilateral approach, seeking cooperation with other global powers where their interests align, rather than trying to do everything unilaterally.
Using multilateralism as a way to leverage resources and expertise. Makes sense.
Exactly. The source uses the example of the Chabahar port in Iran.
Chabahar, right.
India has been working on developing this port for around 13 years, but progress has been slow and the project remains incomplete. The source argues that instead of India trying to develop Chabahar entirely on its own,
It could have partnered up?
it could have pursued co-development with partners, perhaps like Japan, leveraging their financial capacity and technological expertise. The suggestion is to build a loose multilateral coalition driven by Indian strategic objectives and interests for such major projects.
As a way to mitigate those unilateral biases.
Exactly, to mitigate India's self-imposed unilateral biases, as the source puts it.
That makes a lot of sense. Sharing the load and leveraging partners seems more practical.
It does. Despite these implementation challenges, the underlying essence of the new policy, according to the source, is the effort to build a new geo-economic constituency in the neighborhood.
Geo-economic constituency, using economic ties to create a sphere of strategic alignment, basically.
Precisely. At the heart of Neighborhood First is the deliberate strategic use of economic diplomacy. The goal is not just aid or trade for their own sake, but leveraging commercial engagement, investment, and connectivity to limit the space available for China's influence and expand India's own presence.
Using economics strategically.
Yes, the intense focus on regional trade enabled by improved connectivity is central to this geo-economic strategy. The policy also seeks to leverage India's increasingly close ties with the USA to enhance its role in South Asia,
The U.S. angle.
aiming to emerge more clearly as a net security provider in the region.
A net security provider is someone who contributes to the overall security architecture of the region, rather than just consuming security.
Yes, indicating a willingness and growing capacity to take on greater security responsibilities.
Another interesting facet of neighborhood, first highlighted by the source, is India's increasing efforts to find ways to bypass Pakistan in regional integration efforts.
Bypassing Pakistan, why is that necessary? Well, the source colorfully describes Pakistan as the slowest camel in the caravan when it comes to regional economic integration.
Hey.
This is because Pakistan has consistently insisted that meaningful economic progress and connectivity within SAARC can only happen after the long-standing political disputes, particularly Kashmir, are successfully resolved.
So politics first, then economics.
That's Pakistan's stance. India, under Neighborhood First, is trying to pursue economic integration and connectivity with other neighbors without being held hostage by this political logjam with Pakistan.
So if one partner is unwilling or unable to move forward, India is finding alternative paths to keep the momentum going elsewhere.
Exactly. This is seen in India's efforts to strengthen relationships with countries like Afghanistan and Iran, partly as alternative routes to Central Asia, bypassing Pakistan. The source also introduces the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal Motor Vehicle Agreement, or BBNMVA, as a prime example of this bypass mechanism.
ABI and MVA, creating sub-regional groupings that exclude Pakistan to push forward connectivity.
Yes, the BBIN-MVA is presented as a way to create a potentially dynamic South Asian growth quadrangle among those four countries. This sub-regional focus is also tied to India's perspective on the vast, often untapped energy potential across this specific sub-region.
What kind of energy potential are we talking about in that BBIN area?
The source points to the immense hydroelectric potential in Nepal and Bhutan.
Huge hydro potential there.
Yes, and significant endowments of coal in parts of West Bengal and Bihar in India, as well as hydrocarbons in Bangladesh, Assam, and Tripura. This entire zone is rich in energy resources.
Right.
And integrating these resources through cross-border grids and transport links is seen as a major opportunity under Neighborhood First and initiatives like BBIN.
This focus on the BBI Mendri and energy links also seems connected to India's strategy for its own northeastern states, doesn't it?
It is, very much so. India's Act East policy, which focuses on strengthening ties with Southeast Asia, is deeply intertwined with the Neighborhood First policy and initiatives like BBI and MBA.
That's so.
The strategy envisages developing India's northeastern region, which borders Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Myanmar, and is close to Nepal as a crucial growth engine, transforming it from a peripheral area into a hub for connectivity and trade with the neighborhood and beyond towards Southeast Asia.
And all of this ties back to a fundamental shift in how India views its own borders, doesn't it? You touched on this.
That's a crucial point highlighted repeatedly by the source. Under Neighborhood First, there's a deliberate effort to change the long-standing perception of India's borders.
How so?
They are no longer primarily seen as incommunicable walls meant solely to protect India from outside interference. Instead, the emphasis has shifted to seeing borders as connectors.
Borders as bridges, enabling interaction, not just barriers.
Precisely. This isn't just about building physical infrastructure for trade and transport, although that's key. It's a broader mindset change aimed at facilitating the speedy and smooth movement of goods, obviously, but also people, ideas, culture, and technology across these borders. It's about fostering a sense of shared space and interconnectedness.
And is this shift towards economic integration driven purely by the desire for shared growth, or are there other motivations at play, according to the source?
The source suggests a more nuanced motivation. Historically, India was somewhat reluctant about deep economic integration with neighbors, partly because it feared it might lose the diplomatic leverage it held through providing economic aid, the dependency factor.
Right, losing leverage.
But the current thinking underpinning Neighborhood First is that deep economic integration, enabled by this new view of borders, can actually serve as a powerful engine to fuel stronger political ties and yield significant positive economic results for India as well as the neighbors.
So economics driving politics.
In a sense, yes. It's about looking beyond the more limited security-focused mindset of the earlier Monroe Doctrine days and genuinely favoring cooperation for mutual benefit, recognizing that shared prosperity can create a more stable neighborhood than dominance ever could.
To bring some of these initiatives to life, the source also mentions several high-profile early visits that signaled the seriousness of the Neighborhood First policy. Can you remind us of those?
Yes, these early visits were strategically important to demonstrate India's commitment from the very top. Prime Minister Modi's very first foreign visit after taking office in 2014 was to Bhutan.
Bhutan first.
Immediately signaling the priority given to the closest neighbors. He also visited Nepal, further strengthening the idea of prioritization after a long gap in high-level visits.
Okay.
Perhaps most significantly, a landmark visit to Bangladesh was undertaken, which culminated in the signing and ratification of the long-pending land boundary agreement.
A huge deal, that agreement.
A major step in resolving a complex historical issue, yes. He also visited Sri Lanka after a considerable gap and made a point of being the first Indian head of government to visit the northern province.
The Tamil region.
Yes, the Tamil majority region, sending a message of inclusivity and engagement with all parts of the country.
So these visits were concrete actions backing up the stated policy of prioritization and engagement, showing, not just telling.
Exactly. The basic idea underpinning these actions and the policy as a whole is for India to proactively shape events and dynamics in its neighborhood, rather than simply reacting to them.
Taking initiative.
Yes. This is seen as aligning with India's broader quest for a larger global role and its stated willingness to shoulder greater responsibilities, starting with its immediate surroundings.
This sounds like a policy with ambitious goals and a clear vision for shifting away from past approaches. However, the source also dedicates a section to what it calls instances of subtle, distasteful, and unimaginative diplomacy, suggesting implementation hasn't always matched the vision. That sounds critical.
It's a critical section, yes. And the source acknowledges upfront that while neighborhoods first began with a positive burst of energy, things haven't always progressed smoothly on the ground. It points to allegations from several neighboring countries that highlight the challenges India faces in managing these sensitive relationships.
Okay, let's look at Nepal first. What are the specific allegations mentioned there?
Nepal has lodged allegations that India has, at times, interfered in its internal political affairs, and this interference has caused considerable resentment.
Interference? How?
Specifically, the source mentions India's public expression of unhappiness with the Nepali constitution promulgated in 2015.
Right, the Medheshi issue was a link to that.
Exactly. It was linked to the Medheshi issue. The concerns of minority communities in the southern plains bordering India who felt that the constitution didn't adequately protect their rights. India's reaction was seen by many in Nepal as interference.
Okay, what else?
Furthermore, Nepal alleged that India imposed a blockade on essential supplies following the constitutional crisis, which led Nepal to formally complain to the United Nations.
A blockade, that's serious.
Very serious. And another very sensitive allegation mentioned is Nepal's claim that India used its External Intelligence Agency, RNAW.
The Research and Analysis Wing.
Yes, RNAW, in an attempt to topple the previous government led by KP Sharma Oli.
Wow. Regime change allegations.
Yes. The source does note that bilateral relations have since normalized at present following a 2017 visit by Nepali President Bijaya Devi Bhandari to India. But these allegations illustrate the deep-seated suspicions that can surface.
Those are certainly serious allegations of India overstepping its bounds. What about in Sri Lanka? Any issues there mentioned?
In Sri Lanka, similar allegations of interference surfaced during a period of political transition. The source mentions claims that the then RNAW station chief in Colombo, K. Alongo, was actively supporting the political followers of Maithripala Sirisena.
Who is challenging Rajapaksa?
Yes, who were working to unseat the then President Mahinda Rajapaksa's government back in 2015.
And what about the Maldives? Similar story.
Allegations from the Maldives relate to India's reaction to the arrest of former President Mohammed Nasheed in 2015.
Nasheed's arrest.
Yes. The Maldives government alleged that India was over-enthusiastic and displayed inappropriate behavior by publicly issuing a statement expressing concern over Nasheed's arrest. This was perceived in Maldives as unwarranted interference in their internal judicial and political processes.
So a common thread seems to be neighbors perceiving India as trying to influence their domestic politics, sometimes heavy-handedly.
That's the consistent pattern highlighted by these examples in the source. And based on these instances, the source offers a pointed critique of India's diplomatic approach at times, suggesting it undermines the goals of neighborhood first.
What is that critique from the source? What should India be doing differently?
Well, the source directly states that India needs to stop behaving like the erstwhile British Raj, referring back to that historical period of dominance. It argues that Indian diplomats need to shed the mindset of acting like viceroys in their dealings with sovereign neighbors. A key point of critique is India's difficulty in accepting that neighbors, being independent states, have the right to engage with other global powers.
Including China.
Including China, for investment or other cooperation. The source argues that India must recognize and respect a neighbor's right to follow up with China for investment opportunities, without viewing it automatically as an unfriendly act or a betrayal.
A call for more respect for neighbors' autonomy and their choices.
Precisely. The source advocates for India to resort to more patient, respectful diplomacy rather than resorting to perceived arrogance, coercion, or critically engaging in actions that neighbors interpret as attempts at regime change.
Patient diplomacy over coercion.
Yes. It suggests India should focus on building long-term stability through development, economic ties, and genuine infrastructure cooperation, rather than what is termed coercive diplomacy.
And has there been any official Indian body also commenting on India's approach or the resources dedicated to the neighborhood?
Yes, the source references a recent observation made by an Indian Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs.
What did they find?
This committee noted with concern that India's overall aid allocation to its neighbors has actually decreased in recent times.
Decreased? Really?
Yes, the committee deemed this decrease not a positive sign, particularly in the context of the stated goals of the Neighborhood First policy, which emphasizes development and economic partnership.
That seems to completely contradict the development compact idea at the heart of the policy.
It does, doesn't it? It suggests a potential disconnect between the high-level policy pronouncements and the actual resource allocation on the ground. The source concludes this critical section by stressing that for the Neighborhood First policy to move beyond rhetoric and be truly effective, it absolutely needs to be bolstered by a much deeper, nuanced understanding of the specific political, historical, social, and economic dynamics of each individual neighbor.
More tailored approaches.
Yes. The assessment is that the current capacity within India's foreign bureaucracy, in terms of both numbers and specialized expertise, is inadequate for this level of detailed, sensitive engagement required for building lasting relationships and trust.
So a call for more resources and more specialized expertise in dealing with each unique neighbor. Another key aspect to the source highlights is the critical role of India's own border states in success of this neighborhood policy. How do they fit in?
This is a vital link. The source argues that India's border states, those directly adjacent to neighboring countries, play an absolutely critical role in ensuring a peaceful and cooperative neighborhood. Their stability, development, and effective governance have a direct impact on bilateral relations.
And how does their development link to India's broader regional strategy?
The source sees the development of these border states as directly supporting India's ambition to be a regional power. A prosperous, well-connected, and stable border region within India projects strength and provides a more effective platform for engaging with neighbors.
Makes sense.
Developing these states is highlighted as a high-priority agenda, not just under Neighborhood First, but also explicitly under the Act East policy, which aims to connect India's northeast with Southeast Asia through Bangladesh and Myanmar.
This brings us back to the focus on connectivity again.
Precisely. Under Neighborhood First, India has significantly augmented its focus on connectivity with and participation in South Asia, the BBIN-MVA, which we discussed as a bypass mechanism.
Right. Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal.
That's also a prime example of this, specifically undertaken on the theme of sub-regional cooperation.
And where do the northeastern states fit into that specific initiative, the BBIN?
The northeastern states are strategically envisaged as the core hub of the BBIN-MVA. Developing their infrastructure and connectivity is crucial for making this sub-regional initiative work, facilitating trade and movement of goods and people between Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and India's northeast.
So they're central to it.
Yes. The source also mentions a special focus on developing riverine transport.
River transport.
Yes, which is highly relevant given the geography of Bangladesh and India's eastern states, offering a cheaper and often more efficient mode for freight movement.
And this all reinforces that changed perception of borders you mentioned earlier, seeing them as connectors.
It does. It's about cementing that mindset change, seeing borders not as barriers or defensive lines, but as active connectors. This change in perspective is vital not just for physical infrastructure, but for facilitating the speedy and seamless movement of goods, people, ideas, culture, and technology across these boundaries.
It sounds like economic integration is really the driving force behind many of these specific initiatives and the new border perspective. Is that fair to say?
It appears to be a major driver, yes. The source reiterates that India was previously hesitant about deep economic integration, partly fearing it might diminish the leverage derived from aid.
Right, the aid leverage point.
But the prevailing view now, underpinning Neighborhood First, is that robust economic integration, creating mutual interdependence, can powerfully fuel political ties and unlock significant economic benefits for all involved, including India.
So mutual benefit through economics.
Exactly. It's a strategic choice to move beyond the historical Monroe Doctrine mindset towards favoring cooperation, believing that shared economic stakes create a more stable and favorable regional environment than the pursuit of dominance ever could.
Okay, so to summarize and synthesize everything we've discussed, what does the source identify as the primary motivations and objectives driving this Neighborhood First policy? Why is India doing this?
The source's conclusion clearly outlines several key reasons. Firstly, India wants a stable neighborhood because it's absolutely essential for its own sustained domestic economic growth. Instability next door creates security risks and hinders economic potential. Pretty straightforward.
Stability at home requires stability next door. Makes sense. What else?
Secondly, a strong, stable, and cooperative neighborhood gives a significant boost to India's global ambitions, helping it emerge as a credible net security provider on a larger international stage.
So regional strength underpins global influence. Got it.
Precisely. Thirdly, the policy enables India to effectively peddle off economic diplomacy to its neighbors. The source suggests that the offer of economic partnership, investment, and connectivity is hard for neighbors to resist,
It's an attractive offer.
giving India a valuable tool for engagement and influence.
Economic ties as a strategic lever. Okay. Fourth.
Fourthly, a core objective is to bring more concrete economic and connectivity benefits for all the states in the region, not just India. It's framed as mutually beneficial growth.
Shared prosperity.
Fifthly, the policy operates on the premise that if neighbors refrain from actively undermining India's core national interests, they can enhance their ties with India for greater regional economic integration.
So a degree of reciprocity is still expected there, even if it's not the strict non-reciprocity of the Gujral Doctrine. It's more like, don't work against us.
That seems to be the subtle implication in the source's summary, yes, a baseline of not undermining core interests.
Okay. What else?
Sixthly, the process of economic integration itself is seen as creating a more conducive environment for addressing long-standing political negotiations. As economies become intertwined, the incentive for political stability and cooperation increases.
So shared economic interests can pave the way for political solutions down the line.
That's the hope, yes. Seventhly, subsequent political negotiations that are backed by this growing economic dependence and shared interest are expected to lead to the overall stabilization of the South Asian region.
Stabilization through interdependence.
Right. And finally, the source concludes that by establishing enduring primacy, or perhaps more accurately, fostering stability, positive interdependence, and influence in its immediate neighborhood, India significantly strengthens its position and credibility to emerge as a credible global power on the world stage.
It all circles back to that idea that regional effectiveness is the foundation for global standing. You need a stable base. And the SARC satellite, launched by India's space agency, ISRO, on May 5, 2017, is again mentioned as a tangible example of focusing on these economic and developmental priorities for the region, right?
Yes, it's presented as a clear technical initiative aimed at supporting the neighbors' developmental needs through shared satellite services for things like teleeducation and telemedicine, fitting that development for all mantra.
Okay, that's been a remarkably comprehensive journey through the evolution of India's neighborhood policy. Let's just quickly trace the path we've covered to anchor it for you, the listener.
Good idea. We began by looking at the British legacy of buffer states and the double line of defense based on controlling reverse slopes. How partition fundamentally disrupted that, leading to independent India viewing regional instability and external intervention as major security threats.
Which gave rise to the idea of an Indian Monroe Doctrine.
Right, despite lacking the full capacity of a classic hegemon.
Then we saw Nehru's focus on global non-alignment, perhaps diverting some attention from the neighborhood, followed by Indira Gandhi's introduction of bilateralism, and, crucially, a willingness to intervene militarily.
Which continued under Rajiv Gandhi, creating the perception of India as an interventionist, albeit perhaps not a genuinely beneficial regional hegemon. More perceptual than real in terms of benefits provided.
Right. That interventionist approach generated significant anti-Indian sentiment, leading to the realization post-Cold War that a new strategy was needed.
Definitely. This transition saw P.V. Narasimha Rao's hands-off period, and then I.K. Gujral's notable doctrine of non-reciprocity and generosity.
Which sounded good.
Which, while appreciated, faced internal hurdles and practical limitations, particularly on trade, and he didn't have much time.
We then saw the BJP era grappling with immediate security threats and struggling with SARC integration, despite a grand vision for a South Asian Union.
Partly due to insisting on security guarantees and historical trade barriers, and Pakistan's position.
And the Manmohan Singh government continued aspects of Gujral's approach more quietly, without the label.
All of this set the stage for the current Neighborhood First policy, launched formally in 2014. This policy emerged from the post-Cold War context defined by increased external power involvement, particularly China's rise.
Big factor.
The recognition of past policy shortcomings, scholarly critiques of India's limited effective influence, and that persistent regional trend of looking outwards rather than inwards for cooperation.
And the stated goals of Neighborhood First are ambitious, linking India's development to the region's, fostering a developmental compact through aid and connectivity, shifting from a security-first past to an economically integrated future.
Aiming to be a net security provider, leveraging economic diplomacy strategically, bypassing obstacles like Pakistan where necessary.
And fundamentally changing the perception of borders from walls to connectors. That's the vision.
Yet, as the source soberingly points out, the realities of implementation present significant challenges. Inadequate resources, insufficient diplomatic capital for project follow-through.
The follow-through issue again.
A tendency towards going solo instead of using multilateral partnerships, and instances of diplomacy perceived by neighbors as subtle, distasteful, even echoing the interventionism of the past.
Right, the Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives examples.
The critique highlights the need for greater capacity, more nuanced understanding of neighbors, and more consistent follow-through.
So it's a picture of India trying to navigate a very complex, historically charged neighborhood. It's attempting to balance its desire for stability and influence with the sensitivities of its smaller neighbors, the increasing involvement of external powers, particularly China,
Always China.
capacity constraints within its own system, and the enduring legacy of past approaches. It's a policy with a compelling vision of shared prosperity, but facing significant headwinds in its practical application.
It certainly is. The source paints a vivid picture of India trying to chart a new course, one that moves beyond historical doctrines and past missteps towards a more development-centric and cooperative model. Yet, it's clearly struggling with the practicalities of capacity building, consistent implementation, and perhaps most importantly, overcoming the deep-seated perceptions of its intentions among its neighbors.
Fascinating stuff. Really complex.
Yeah.
So what stands out to you from this deep dive into India's neighborhood policy? The source lays out this evolution and the current approach, highlighting both the aspiration for shared development and the persistent challenges in implementation and perception, from resource constraints to allegations of interference.
You know, it really makes you reflect on the sheer difficulty for any large regional power trying to genuinely foster cooperation and shared prosperity amongst its neighbors. It's just hard. When you have a complex history, power imbalances, and strategic competition from other global players constantly in the background, how truly possible is it to move past the old dynamics of dominance and suspicion and build something based purely on mutual benefit? It's a huge challenge.
That's a powerful question to consider. The gap between the strategic vision and the messy reality of regional relationships is always where the true complexity lies, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you a much clearer, more informed perspective on this crucial and often overlooked aspect of international relations.